Hi, my name is William Nguyen. This is my video on Intro to Pythagorean trig identities. So to explore these identities, we need to know the Pythagorean theorem, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. It's modeled by this triangle. Now, knowing this, we can use this to find trig ratios of sine, cosine, and tangents, and we can remember what the ratios are with SOHCAHTOA. So sine of theta will be the opposite A over hypotenuse C. The cosine of theta will be the adjacent B over the hypotenuse C, and tangent of theta will be opposite A over adjacent B. Now knowing this, we can prove the Pythagorean identity sine squared of theta plus cosine squared of theta equals 1, because it basically just works around to be a squared plus b squared divided by c squared. And since we know a squared plus b squared equals c squared, that turns out to be c squared over c squared, which is equal to 1 because they're the same. Now we can work on an example problem. Sine x plus square root of cosine x plus 1 equals 0. We're going to have to solve this so that we can find an angle that will make this equal 0. So we start off with the equation here, and we're going to square both sides to get rid of the square root from this part of the equation. And that will give us sine squared of x plus cosine x plus 1 equals 0. Now moving on, we're going to change sine squared x to 1 minus cosine squared x. I want to explain how that works. Now, we know that sine squared of x plus cosine squared of x equals 1. So how do we make it equal to cosine squared x? Well, all we have to do is basically subtract sine squared x and subtract -1, both sides. So I modeled it with these arrows to show which side it's going to go to. Now it will be -1 plus cosine squared x, or theta, equals negative sine squared x, or theta. And that will equal 1 minus cosine squared x equals sine squared x. And that's why we can change sine squared x to 1 minus cosine squared x. Now having that, we have 1 minus cosine squared x plus cosine x plus 1 equals 0. And I moved this one to this one, added, got a 2, and then I multiplied the entire equation with -1 so that I can move the negative from the front, and that leaves us with cosine squared x minus cosine x minus 2 equals 0. Finally, we can split this up and try to find the zeros. So it will be cosine squared x plus 1 times cosine x minus 2. Sorry, not squared x, just x. And we know to find 0, cosine x has to either equal -1 or 2. And cosine never equals 2 in the unit circle. So we know that the only answer has to be pi, because the coordinates of pi is -1, -1, 2. And x is cosine, y is sine. So that's the answer, pi. That's the answer to making this equal 0. And we can even put it in if you wanted to. Since we know it's -1, 0, we know sine is y and cosine is x. This will equal 0, and this will equal -1. So -1 plus 1 equals 0, and the square root of 0 equals 0. So that all works out. And yeah, that's my video on the intro to a Pythagorean identity. Thank you.